Hi, and welcome to Fork in the Road. My name is Rusty Gaylord. I am your host. I'm very excited to have Jay Rogers back with us today. He is the first time I've brought a person back on the show, and we are talking about 15 principles of leadership. Fork in the Road is live every Wednesday at noon Pacific time, and we always have interesting guests on business leaders, people from various walks of life, thought leaders who have an interesting perspective to share on life and on leadership and on success and how they got there. So invite you, if you're watching live, to ask your questions in the chat, jump in and say hello. We welcome your interaction in the show. And without further ado, let's bring on Jay. Welcome, Jay.
Hey, thanks, Rusty. Happy to be here.
All right, awesome. Well, let's jump in. Hey, so we're talking about 15 principles of leadership, and some of this, at least the root of it, came from your time in the Marines when you were a captain in the Marines and leading a group of soldiers. But you certainly had an idea of leadership before then, and so I'm curious, how did your view of leadership change during your time in the Marines?
I mean, for me, I think my view of leadership was expanded. It was one where it opened my eyes to what being a leader really meant. I felt like I was such an infant once I had spent time going through the military and learning about different leaders, bad ones, good ones, and then learning doctrine where other people had spent a lot of time, decades, centuries thinking about leadership and looking at other people that have been good and bad leaders. So I learned a lot. It expanded my mind.
Yeah. Well, so what was something new that you learned as in your time in the Marines, or whether it's a structure or a concept or one specific aspect of leadership that you weren't aware of before that came into focus for you?
Oh, so I think first was what does it mean to be a leader? Came into focus as the military promoted traits and principles, and they basically said, if you're going to be a leader, work on these traits or work on these principles, espousing them, learning them, other things like that. And at first, I was pretty skeptical because I was like, there's no recipe for leadership, and if there is, it's got to be simpler than a long list, and it is in the way that the military put it forward, a long list. So at the beginning, I started being skeptical. And then when I began to be in the position of leading Marines in training, and then eventually in operations and in combat operations, at that, it really pushed me to think about leadership in a more maybe thoughtful way. And so that's what started my lifelong adherence and study of leadership traits and principles. I needed it.
Yeah. Well, so let's get specific about what some of those are. And I know you've got a list of 15, and just as we were getting started, you just talked about having a long list. There's a part of me that's like 15. Man, how am I supposed to keep track of 15 traits and principles? Right? It's like maybe 3 or 4 or 5 seems more manageable. How did you get to 15, and pick 1 or 2 of those that you've got a little story around, and like how did you really come to believe that they should be on the list? They're important enough to be there.
So one of the first things that I found was like you can release yourself from needing to be good at all 15. I've never met a leader that's good at all 15. So
Hmm.
it's a touchstone. It's to say, and other people have written on subjects like this. Malcolm Gladwell has written on certain types of things like this. There are other people, Stephen Covey has written on these kinds of things. And I think one thing I take away from those authors is know your strengths. You may not always be able to improve on your weaknesses, but you can work around them. And I think having the fact that there are a list of great traits and principles for the ideal leader, know where you're good. And if you are weak, know how to work around it. First thing that I would learn. Pick 1 or 2, as you said. Like, I love courage. Courage is such an
And hey, while
obvious.
you're
Yeah,
doing that,
yeah,
I'm just going
please.
to put these up on the screen so that we can, so that everyone watching can see them. So go ahead. Courage.
Awesome. So I love courage. And there's a reason why it's kind of listed as one of the longest ones. You could almost break it apart into 2 parts. But here, as we talk about it, moral and physical courage. Um, to be courageous, for most people, they would say, wow, that person's a leader, because they're courageous. They stepped forward when it was hard. And it's interesting because it also shows the subtlety of this list. You would think that if somebody is independent, they might be courageous, because to some people, being independent means you think for yourself, and that's courageous. And then you might think that if I take the initiative, which you see in this list also, that I might be courageous because I step forward and I do something when nobody was asking. And so that's taking the initiative. And there are other things in here which might be seen as part of being courageous, but they don't encapsulate it all. And so in the military, quickly, one of the things I learned, and this was a simple example, is I was in a training evolution, and I was in a very difficult area of a training range that was far away from any nearby help, a couple hundred miles, if you will. And we had to move a long distance in this training evolution. And we had been flown in by helicopter and dropped off, and it was hot, and there was not a lot of water to be had. So while it was training, it was difficult to pursue. And so for me, I had to have the physical courage to be water deprived, and I had with me at least 13 other Marines that were following me in this training, and it quickly became something where my usage of water became the defining factor of how to keep people calm in this. And once people were calm and felt like they would be taken care of, even though we had much less water than we wanted, it gave them the feeling that I was going to lead them through the evolution. And that is nowhere on this list, the need for staying calm in the face of limited water, other than physical courage. And it was the central element that caused people to follow me through what was a training evolution and not even combat. That's an example.
Yeah, super interesting. And I love the fact that a lot of this stems from the military, because when you think about the military, clearly leadership is one of the elements that comes to the forefront, because it's just it's so much of the intensity and environments that you're in as a military person. Having good leadership is critical. You've left the military and spent years in the business world. And I'm curious if you have some stories about where do you see this? How has this come to play in the business world? Like, what have you noticed? And specifically, maybe there's something you can talk to about that. You've mentioned that one of the ways you learn most about leadership is when you're surrounded or around someone who's not a good leader, because you see the gaps, and you can learn from that. So I'm curious if there's a story or a learning you can share from your time being around someone who was not a good leader in the business world.
So I think that I'll give a great one, and I won't call people out by name, but what I will say is that being a good follower and followership is something that you pick up in a lot of the different tendrils of this list. For example, when you are unselfish, that means that you will put other people before yourself. That means you're willing to follow somebody else if they have a good idea when you're doing things. And so I can think of several people who were in leadership positions who had what we call the problem of, they had two mouths and one ear. And there are many languages that have that as a phrase. And so they're not unselfish. They want to lead by bludgeoning. They like to brainstorm versus brainwrite. And so I learned one of these concepts, which I've now heard espoused in a number of places, which is when you're listening for other people's ideas, if you want to be a leader and you truly want to hear, you have to think of how to get the people who are afraid to say something to say something. And sometimes that's not even saying it. Sometimes it's actually writing it, which is why I use that word brain writing versus brainstorming. And so I think some of the worst leaders that I've worked with before were in a leadership position, and they only wanted to talk, or they only wanted to hear from people that could be louder or more expository than they were. And being a listener and being unselfish and thinking about other people's ideas is a great way to stop that habit. It's not that you're a bad leader, but that's a bad trait, and that can make you a worse leader or a less effective leader. And so every time I get into an exercise with a group, and I say, what are some ideas? One way I'll stop myself is I'll say, here's a piece of paper. Everybody write down your idea. Because then in the privacy of their own notepad, they get to say what they want. And then they can hand it in without their name on it. And it's just a little thing that said, you care what I think without caring how I say it. And so I think
Yeah.
that can be great, and that is a really awesome way to exhibit several traits here. It's good judgment, it's unselfish because you're listening to people, it's tactful. There's a whole lot of things in there that are picked up by that with a little exercise.
It's interesting, it reminds me of times that I worked at Apple, and I worked with people all over the world, and there were cultural differences that fit into this as well. So we'd get on a phone call, and you'd have people from all over the world. Certain people are way more likely to speak up than others, and I got really comfortable leaving gaps of silence. I would ask a question, and then I would be silent, and it really took a longer silence than most people are willing to tolerate before other people would start to contribute and start to talk. So I'm just thinking about this, tapping on some of these traits about how do you get people to participate and to share their viewpoint. And one of the ways is silence and writing, and there's many ways to do it, but there's different techniques. But super interesting.
I'd like to build on that. One of the best leaders I ever worked for exhibited a trait that I could never understand until much later on in my career, but he talked really quietly. And what happened was that what he said had so much moment, that people began to want to hear it, and he never raised his voice. In fact, he was always just a little bit below the comfortable level, so people had to be quiet to hear him, and it was incredibly impressive. And that gentleman ended up becoming the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff in the United States, and he was a four-star general named Peter Pace. And I'll tell you what, I've learned so much about how quiet he was in a room when he talked, never raising his voice. And he was one of the best leaders that I've ever known or had the opportunity to work for. And that comes from being vulnerable. It comes from having bearing. It comes from exhibiting a steady listening gait and being unselfish with your time.
Well, you just mentioned vulnerability, and I'm interested in that because I look at this list and a lot of these things on here, like I think a lot of us would associate with leadership: decisiveness, independence, dependability, and there's a lot of those that you say, yeah, of course, that's what a leader would have. Vulnerability I think is interesting. I happen to agree with you that it belongs on the list, but I'm curious about how it got there. Is that something that came through the military? Is this something that came from your own experience?
This came from my own experience, and it brings up another point that I have carefully worked this list. There have been times where I've tried to combine and then retaken things apart, and then I rarely add to the list. And as I may have shared with you, I've got another two that are sitting in the wings that I may add to the list. I can talk about that in a little bit, but basically vulnerability is one that I've added to the list. And this would be my Aslan quotient, so to speak. Or you could find it as sort of your Harriet Tubman quotient. There are many different forms of people who have been vulnerable in the past. And through that vulnerability, they have risen to leadership status. And I think those concepts are pretty obvious, but you have to be willing to lay yourself out in service of others in order to be able to attain that level of leadership. And we all know it when we see it. I think it's the virtue of sainthood. You have to have performed a miracle in order to become a saint in the Catholic Church. That has this concept of leadership embedded in it, but it's leadership through vulnerable service. And so it's a trait. You don't have to be great at it. You could still be a great leader and leave vulnerability off. But it definitely, for the people that are extremely strong in it, they rise from a lying down position to the top of an organization.
Yeah. So I think it raises. So your comment there about you don't have to be great at it. I'd love to hear you talk a little bit more about that, and how do you assess yourself and other people against these traits?
So, meaning the first question, you don't have to be great at all these. I've never met anybody that's great at all these. I think
Mhm.
that's what's interesting in the way I think about it is some people just simply sidestep them. Either it's not one of these traits is not part of what they're called to do. It's not part of something that's in their daily life. Maybe it's just not something they've been tested at before. A great one is physical courage. If you're not in a job that requires it, you might have it. A great example of that would be like Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain. He was an educator and he became the hero of Little Round Top in the Civil War and then went back to become the president of Bowdoin College. But physical courage for him only was necessary, at least in the look of history, when he was at Little Round Top leading a charge. And so, I mean, but some people don't have it in their job description, so it's not going to show up. That's kind of what I meant. You can put yourself in the position to espouse these traits, and maybe that's a good way to be in your right leadership role. So second question that you had asked, which I think is a good one, is how do I rate myself? So that's the hardest thing to be candid about. I don't like to use the word truthful when I ask an organization that I'm leading to think about when they're grading me. I want them to be candid. I
Mhm.
definitely don't want them to lie because that wouldn't be like in the rubric of where we're trying to go. But being candid about those things means I'm already immediately going to be vulnerable. And so you could call them 360-degree reviews. You could leave time during every evaluation you make of somebody on your team to say, how do you feel about how I'm doing? Immediately your vulnerability is going to bring you up in right then or later on when they think about it or when they think about leading people in the future. That kind of vulnerability and willingness to be
Mhm.
to listen and to hear is going to make you a stronger leader. It's not the right moment for everything. If you are counseling somebody because of something that they did wrong, asking them how you feel about they feel about your performance might be misplaced at that time. But for lots of times when you're just reviewing people, taking the opportunity to be reviewed on these same traits and principles as a leader is a good one.
Yeah. Well, speaking of that, then, like, how do you employ this? If you've got people on your team that you're coaching and developing, or if you want to be coached and developed, do you do you explicitly use these 15 traits and highlight strengths and opportunities for people? How do you actually put this into practice?
I do. And so I take a strengths finder approach that's using basically, a rubric that's out there, which is saying, there are lots of strengths. I'm not going to focus on your weaknesses. Here are the leadership traits and principles. And I start this with my leaders. I don't ask everybody to be judged on a basis of leadership. I do like the concept of like managers climb a hill expertly, leaders choose which hill to climb. And I
Mhm.
think that if you think about that, I use this rubric when I'm thinking about training the people who are choosing which hill to climb. I don't think about it when I'm judging somebody off of their expert management or off of their great tactics or off of the things that they can do in a business or in a function or in a team or in an organization. And so leaders first. And then if they're
Mhm.
in that leadership position of choosing which hill to climb, then I will write them down and I will say, this is the list. We're not going to talk about them all. That would take too long and it would be boring and other things like that. But I'd like you to look it over before we get together. And I'd like to think where you're strong and where you might feel like you have weaknesses. And let's talk about them. And so that's how I do it every time. And then people have a chance to give their cut on what they think these words mean. And that's how
Mhm.
I use the tool. And I write it down for
Good.
them because it's hard to remember them all. And that's a great way to start.
Yeah. I want to pick out bearing. I've done a couple of workshops recently on executive presence, and that seems to resonate with people because people
Mm,
are interested in the idea of executive presence, but it's not very well
mm,
defined. And to me, bearing is probably the closest connection to this idea of executive presence. But I want to check out: am I interpreting that correctly? And how do you assess bearing? Similar to how I would ask someone, how do you assess executive presence? How do you know when it's there?
Great concept. So every one of us will probably and does develop touchstones around these traits or traits that are like them in your life. Bearing, when I have a touchstone, I think of the following image. When you lead a battalion or a division inspection, you will have somewhere between 900, maybe even several thousand people in physical view for inspection. You think of these large parade reviews that you see in communist North Korea or in, the Soviet Union, but we have them in military all over the world. What's interesting about that is when you are in the follower position, you're always thinking about first, am I going to pass inspection? Is my rifle clean? Is my uniform, clean? Do I have smudges on my buttons? All those sorts of things. I never thought about this from the other perspective. When you are the reviewing officer and you stand in front of 1,000 sets of eyes, 2,000 eyes, if you will, you are being judged 2,000 times, whereas you are just judging a person one time. And so it's actually the bearing of the leader that is a harder lift. And inevitably, things happen. But it's how did you come to inspection? Not how did you come to inspect the people who follow you? And when you start to have that mental mindset of people are watching me, you understand why people are interested in executive presence because you're being watched 2,000 times. You're being watched by double the number of eyes and the number of people that have are in a Zoom meeting or other things like that. And you should be prepared to have the bearing when somebody interrupts you, when things go wrong, when it doesn't go your way, when your uniform is unclean, before you get on the parade deck. There are lots of ways to be prepared, and there are lots of ways to handle situations that happen when you're being watched. And that is what bearing or executive presence, which is a great way of putting it, that's the vignette that comes to mind. Because people watch you, and it's especially when things are off plan that they're wondering, how do you deal with it? And if your bearing's good, if you can keep a stiff upper lip or you can do other things, that can make you a great leader.
Super interesting because, I one of the ways I just define executive presence is it's the way other people experience you, right? It's certainly you have an element of it, but it's really defined and judged by other people. And that's pretty much what you're saying is, you're being judged by 2,000 pairs of eyes. And how are you going to show up, especially when things don't go the way you expect them to go?
I'll share a very personal story on this one just recently. I was at a funeral for a young man who had died too early, 22 years old, and the minister got up in front of the congregation. He was in a leadership position, and I have rarely seen people with as much bearing as this guy had. Tears were flowing everywhere. And there was the 18 to 25-year-old friend group that was in there. There was the parents group that was there. There were the cousins that were there. There were the co-workers that were there. There were all these constituents of eyes. And that minister had a bearing and a countenance for each group, and he addressed each group individually in his talk, and he shifted his countenance, he shifted where his physical vestments were, he shifted where he looked when he was talking to these people, and I just was marveling at his bearing. And remember, he was a close personal friend of this young man who had died, and he could have been crying. Now, we would not fault him for crying, but as a leader of the congregation, he needed a stiff upper lip to deliver that discussion. And that's bearing, not losing his proverbial stuff up on the podium, but actually being able to keep a stiff upper lip and carry the message out across. That's bearing, and bearing for groups. So it's a personal vignette, I thought, where recently in the last couple of weeks, I have seen a leader of a congregation deliver exceptional bearing in a very stressful situation.
Yeah. Well, Jay, this is such a great conversation, and it would be fun to take each one of these and pick them apart with stories that highlight what it means. And we're not going to take all that at that time. So I appreciate you sharing with us just some of these insights about leadership, right? And how you define it, and these different characteristics and traits, how to look at yourself and evaluate yourself. And also recognizing that you're not going to be good at everything, and you don't have to be good at everything. and to recognize that, which is, I think, is an important element coming into this. Saying, well, gosh, I've got to do it all, and you don't really have to do it all. So, thank you for spending this time together and exploring leadership and these 15 traits.
Thank you, Rusty. It's a pleasure. And for all you aspiring leaders out there, good luck. I hope the list does you well, and add your own things to it. And I'd love to hear about it.
Yeah, fantastic. All right. Thank you so much.
Cheers.